You agree that global growth is the biggest risk to the July 2008 forecast?
Yes, I do.
If the global economy slows or the U.S. stays in a longer recession, then MDI demand growth could be lower?
I would agree with that.
Lower growth could lead to lower earnings?
I would agree with that.
An important component in forecasting EBITDA is correctly using the accurate contribution margin?
I would agree with that.
If the forecasted contribution margin is too high, your forecasted EBITDA is also too high?
I would agree with that.
Huntsman has done studies of the relationship between contribution margin and operating rates?
As I explained earlier on in my direct, we've been looking for many, many years to try and find a linkage, but we have not succeeded in finding one above 85% operating rates.
Let's take a look at Exhibit 988. It is in your binder. This is an email from Mr. Malcolm Hannaby to Mr. Hostetter, and you're copied on December 14th, 2007, correct?
Correct.
It contains analysis of the relationship between occupacity and contribution margin?
Correct.
If you look, we'll pull out the language starting with the correlation. It says the correlation between occupacity and margin is not absolute. But the last slide certainly suggests that with a rule of thumb, you would improve your odds of understanding where margins are going if you look at occupacity. You see that?
Yes.
And the rule of thumb that is explained by Mr. Hannaby is that you look at the prior year occupacity level plus the current year, and that will forecast some direction on margins, right?
That was the study that Mr. Hannaby was looking at, but no, I would not conclude with that. I would not agree with that conclusion.
Okay, you sent him an email, I take it, or memo that you disagreed with him?
I would not think so, because it was a piece of work that Mr. Hannaby was working on Mr. Hostett, which I was copied on, and there's probably 100,000s of pieces of work like this going on in my division, and I probably would not have commented on it.
Let's take a look at the last page of this exhibit. It is a chart that shows the relationship that Mr. Hannaby described. It looks like to me that when, at least on this chart, that when occupacity starts to decline below 94%, there is a decline in contribution margin, at least on this study. You'd agree with that, wouldn't you?
Well, on the basis of this one chart, I mean, possibly, but it then reverses out and goes the other way. I don't see looking at that chart, I'm not a statistician, but I don't see a direct correlation between those two lines on that chart, not a direct correlation.
I understand, but in terms of Mr. Hannaby's rule of thumb analysis, he expresses that relationship in Exhibit 988, right?
He was asked to do some work here, as we have for many years, to try and find a correlation.
And even though there's declining operating margins, there is no year that is expressed where occupacity drops below 85%, right?
In our forecast, the minimum is 90%.
No, you didn't follow my question. I apologize. In Exhibit 988, on the last slide that we're looking at, there doesn't appear to be any year in which occupacity has dropped below 85%, right?
Correct.
Now, let's take a look at Exhibit 747. Again, and look at the occupacity chart. It's JX 747, please. We will look at slide 8. You know, don't you, Mr. Hankins, that we submitted an interrogatory to understand how this occupacity calculation was done?
Yes, I do.
And you know that we received an answer on September the 4th or September the 5th, 2008?
Yes, I do.
Mr. Hostetter worked on that answer, right?
I believe Mr. Hostetter and several others worked on that answer. You're correct.
And then you also know, don't you, that on Tuesday night around midnight we received an amended interrogatory answer that changed some of the figures?
Yes, I do.
And then you know that last night we received a third interrogatory answer that changed the explanation another time, right?
What that third interrogatory was doing was being very precise about the build-up of the capacity and investments over the next 5 years.
Okay. Let's take a look at PX 1522. And you, of course, understand that each time Huntsman submitted one of these interrogatory answers, they swore that the answers were truthful to the best of their knowledge, right?
I do.
And you know that there are differences between when plants are coming online in each of the answers, and the answers are marked as PX 4000, PX 4006, and PX 4008, right?
I do.
And the reason why we have these subsequent iterations of the interrogatory answers is that as you were getting ready for your testimony here, you discovered, or Mr. Hostetter discovered, that there were some errors and they needed to be corrected.
That is correct.
And that's what you've attempted to do.
We've been very open about this. Let me just draw the court to an example. On September the 5th and September the 9th, we forgot to include our own MDI plant. It's unforgivable. It's a terrible mistake, and for which it's regrettable. But I was very, very keen that we correct these when I saw them. I was traveling in China last week and came back over the weekend and glanced at what had been submitted. I really wanted to make sure that the court had the correct information. The key thing here is the totals remain the same. There's no difference to occupancy. It's how those individual plants come online that we have been very precise about.
Right. But it looks like to me, and if you take a look at September 5th, let's look at 2007, the way this works is this is a year-end number. The 4185 is a year-end number for 2007, right?
The 4185 is the year-end number for 2000. That's correct.
Now, when I took your deposition, you told me that the BASF Huntsman plant was already online, operating at 100% capacity at the end of 2007, right?
That is correct.
Now, if we go to the September 9th version of the answer and we pull the same data, you now have put in the BASF Huntsman plant, right?
Correct.
But there's this new concept called startup phasing, right?
Correct.
And that's a negative number, so that takes away from capacity in the next year, right?
Can I explain to the court how this works?
Answer my question, then you can explain. Answer yes or no, then explain.
Please repeat the question.
Sure. The startup phasing of minus 86, that's taking away capacity during the year so that the number for the following year, the end of 2008 number, ends up being lower, right?
In this example, that is correct.
Okay. Now, we know the BASF Huntsman China plant was 100% online at the end of 2007, right?
Correct.
So there should be no phasing for that plant, correct?
Incorrect.
Okay. Why is that?
Because we agreed with the Chinese authorities we would take the plant down twice in 2008 for what we call turnaround and inspections on the repairs and the improvements we'd made since the startup. Therefore, even though the plant is operating at full operating rates, it's not operating for the full annual year. That's the difference.
Why couldn't you get this right the first time?
We made mistakes, and I wanted to make sure we got them right.
And it's not just you made mistakes once. If we go through this, there's a number of mistakes, and they were made on two different occasions, right?
We've made two corrections. The corrections are not material. What I was very keen that we do was provide an accurate report to the court on how this occupacity will be built up. The total occupacity remains the same. It does not affect the operating rates that we've projected.
Isn't it the case that the reason why the Yantai plant, for example, let's look quickly at 2010, and then I want to move on to something else. Look at the September 9th version, the September 9th version of this interrogatory answer. Okay?
Okay.
The Yantai plant is listed as coming online in 2011, right?
In this example, it is, yes.
Now, You knew at the time this interrogatory answer was prepared that the Yantai plant was actually supposed to be 300 kilotons, and it was scheduled to come online in mid-2010, right?
The Yantai plant will...
Can you answer that question, yes or no?
Please repeat the question.
You knew when this interrogatory answer was prepared, that the Yantai plant was 300 kilotons. It was coming online during 2010, right?
I knew that, saw the mistake, and insisted it was corrected and represented back to the court, knowing full well it would probably result in a conversation like this.
Okay, but that's not what you did back in December 2007. Let's take a look at PX 4003. Let's pull this out. This is another email from Malcolm Hanaby to Tony Napton, copied to Mr. Hostetter. He writes, Tony, still on call with Steve/Tony. I assume that's Mr. Hostetter and you, right?
I guess.
And you say, in this example, slide 8, move Yantai from 2010 to 2011 startup. Should avoid 82% occupacity, right?
That's what it says.
Okay, let's look at slide 8 in this document. And by the way, this email is December 2007. If you look at slide 8, it is showing Asian capacity, or Asian occupacity in 2010, right?
Correct.
And it shows the Yantai plant in 2010, correct?
Correct.
And if we want to know the size of the Yantai plant, we go to slide 22. Slide 22, please turn it. Pull it out. The Yantai plant is 300 kilotons, and it's shown in 2010, right?
Correct.
So what was happening in PX 4003 was, well, first of all, PX 4003 was an investment analysis that was being shared with Apollo to justify whether a new MDI plant should be built, right?
That is correct.
And there was concern that if you showed 82% regional occupacity in the Asia region, that would indicate, even under your test, that margins would decline, right?
If that was the inference of the email, it's below 82%, that would affect margins.
And so somebody had the idea, whether it's you or Mr. Hostetter or Mr. Hanaby, let's just move it to 2011 and the occupacity figures will look better, right?
I strongly disagree with that interpretation of what went on.
Well, that's what happened. Somebody moved it to 2011, even though, as you just said now, it belongs in 2010.
The startup of that Yantai plant has been subject to huge speculation about whether it would be built, when it would start up, and our forecasts on the dates of these documents accurately reflect our belief at that moment in time.
Well, let's look at on this slide, it's shown as 2010, right?
On this slide, it's shown at 2010.
And then if we go at JX747 and look at slide 8, JX747, we don't need it side by side. Can we get JX747, please? Look at slide 8. It's even being shown as 300 kilotons in 2010 on this slide, right?
Correct.
So, but when we asked you for the data, the underlying interrogatory to explain exactly how these figures were calculated, the first answer we got was that Yantai was only 200 kilotons, and that was a mistake.
Correct.
And it was in 2011, not 2010, right?
The phasing of the plant will be 200 plus 100, so the mistakes around the phasing and the size of the plant, which we've corrected, in good faith.
When you do these kinds of calculations, you rely on public announcements of plants, right?
Partly.
Okay. And if you take a look at PX 4002, and I'm going to move on to another subject. If you look at PX 4002, that's a collection of announcements concerning MDI plants, right?
Correct.
and take a look at the first page, please. Still, let's pull out the language on the Yantai plant.